deep in the Bada Valley of modern-day Lebanon, there's a complex of ancient ruins. But, this is no ordinary pile of old rocks. See, underneath these incredible Roman columns, there's a foundation so massive, so ridiculously precise, that it just defies any easy explanation. For centuries, it's had engineers and archaeologists completely stumped. And today, we're going to dive into exactly why. To really get a handle on the scale of what we're dealing with here, let's just start with a number. 1,650 tons. I mean, to put that into perspective for you, that's about the same weight as 3 fully loaded Boeing 747 jumbo jets. But here's the kicker. This isn't some modern feat of engineering. Nope. That's the weight of a single block of limestone that was cut out of a quarry thousands of years ago, and it's just one of several mind-bogglingly huge stones at this site. Which, of course, brings us to the one question that lies at the heart of this whole mystery. How on earth did they do it? The place we're talking about is Baalbek. It's this huge, sprawling complex of ruins. And while it's famous for these absolutely stunning Roman temples, the real head-scratcher, the real enigma, is what's buried deeper, the colossal stone platform they decided to build on top of. So the foundation wall of the main temple has these 3 gigantic stones known as the trilithon. Each one weighs around 1,000 tons. But get this, in a quarry nearby, there are even bigger stones just sitting there, unfinished. You've got the stone of the pregnant woman, the stone of the south, and then the forgotten stone, which they just found back in 2014, tipping the scales at that incredible 1,650 tons. And these stones weren't just cut and dropped. The trilithon blocks were somehow moved over a kilometer and then fitted together with just breathtaking precision. So who could have possibly pulled this off? Well, the most common, widely accepted explanation gives all the credit to the undisputed masters of ancient engineering, the Romans. And it makes sense, right? After all, they built their biggest, grandest temples right on top of this very foundation. Back in the Roman era, Baalbek was called Heliopolis, which means City of the Sun. Around 15 BCE, they started building this massive sanctuary to their god Jupiter. And this wasn't just any temple. It became the largest religious building in the entire Roman Empire. It was a huge statement of their power and ambition. But you'll have to understand, the history of this place goes way, way back. We're talking about evidence of people living here for over 11,000 years. It was a major religious site for the Phoenicians, who worshipped the god Baal. That's actually where the name Baalbek comes from. Then it was conquered by Alexander the Great, and only after all those thousands of years of history did the Romans finally show up to build their masterpiece. And this deep, long history is what brings us to the central debate. Was the entire platform, including those 1,000-ton trilithon stones, a masterpiece of Roman engineering, purpose-built for their Temple of Jupiter? Or did the Romans arrive to find that an even older, more mysterious structure was already there, just waiting for them? Okay, so let's start with the mainstream view. The evidence that backs up the Roman construction theory is logical, you can touch it, and honestly, it makes a really strong case. So people who back the Roman theory suggest a method that, look, while it would have been incredibly difficult, it's not technically impossible. They think the stones were cut out and then placed on these huge wooden sleighs, which were then dragged over a path of rollers. To actually get them moving, you'd need massive teams of men powering these complex systems of winches and capstans. We're talking tens of thousands of laborers all working in perfect sync. It would have been one of the most ambitious engineering projects of all time. And there's some hard evidence to back this up. Archaeologists found a stonemason's graffiti on a column dating it to 60 CE. There's even a Roman sketch of the building plan carved into one of the big stones. But here's maybe the most convincing piece of the puzzle. A Roman-style column drum was found underneath the trilithon stones, which would imply the foundation can't be older than the Romans. And to top it off, the quarry is actually slightly uphill from the temple, which means gravity would have been helping them, not fighting them. Okay, that sounds pretty straightforward, right? Case closed? Well, not so fast. Because that's not the whole story. Despite all that strong physical evidence, there are some pretty big holes in the Roman theory. Holes that make a lot of people think we're looking at a much, much older mystery. The single biggest problem with the Roman theory? Silence. Total silence. The Romans were meticulous record keepers. They were obsessed with writing down their big achievements. And yet, there is not one single text, not one mention of this unbelievable project. I mean, why wouldn't they brag about their greatest engineering feat ever? And then there's the stones themselves. The megalithic foundation is way more eroded than the newer Roman temples on top, suggesting it's much older. The blocky, cyclopean style. It looks nothing like typical Roman architecture. And this all kind of lines up with local legends, passed down for centuries, that claim the platform was built by giants in some forgotten age. For the critics, it all really just comes down to practicality. They argue that moving a 1,000-ton block over rough terrain with just some ropes, rollers, and winches is, well, frankly, almost inconceivable. The logistics of coordinating 40,000 men, that's an entire army's worth of labor. And the insane forces involved, it pushes what we know about ancient technology right to its breaking point. You know, Michel Alouf, who used to be a curator at the site, really captured the feeling perfectly. Standing in front of these stones is just, it's a humbling experience. The scale is so far beyond human that it feels, well, almost impossible. So where does all this leave us? We're left with two really compelling stories, right? Each one has its own evidence and each one has its own problems. This is a genuine historical enigma, and there is no easy answer. On the one hand, you've got the archaeological finds, the graffiti, the sketch, that column drum, and they all point directly to the Romans as the master builders. But on the other hand, you have the stones themselves, their impossible size, their apparent age from the erosion, and the complete lack of any written record. All of it just screams of a much deeper, much older origin story. And in the end, that's the real question that Baalbek leaves us with. Are we looking at the absolute pinnacle of Roman engineering genius? Them pushing their skills to the very edge of what was possible? Or are we looking at the ruins of a much older world, from a civilization with capabilities we just don't understand anymore, whose story has been completely lost to time? The stones, well, they aren't talking, leaving us all to wonder. So picture this. Deep in the rugged wilderness of southwestern Montana, there's this structure that just defies any easy explanation. It's a massive wall of granite that was hidden for centuries, and it forces us to ask a really fundamental question. Was it built by the incredible power of nature, or by the hands of some long-forgotten civilization? You know, this whole mystery didn't start with some big funded expedition. Nope. It started with a simple act. Back in 1996, Christopher Borton and Linda Welsh were just working on their own private property, clearing away some dense bushes and trees, when they literally stumbled upon this thing. They had no idea they were about to uncover a mystery that would fascinate people all over the world.
So, what did they actually find out there? I mean, before we can even get into the debate, you really have to appreciate the sheer jaw-dropping scale of what we now call the Sage Wall.
And look, this is not just some random pile of rocks. We are talking about a megalithic structure that stretches for 275 feet. That's nearly the length of a football field, and it's in a remarkably straight line. It stands up to 25 feet high, and get this, that's just what we can see. Research suggests it goes down another 15 feet below the ground, and it's all made from the boulder batholith, this 75-million-year-old chunk of granite that is literally the foundation of the whole mountain range. Okay, so this brings us right to the heart of the mystery. It's the one question that has sparked this huge debate among scientists, historians, you name it. What are we actually looking at here? The whole debate really just boils down to two powerful, completely opposite ideas. On one hand, was this wall just shaped over millions and millions of years by the blind forces of geology, pressure, fracturing, ice, erosion? Or is it a man-made structure, a piece of precision engineering left behind by an ancient, maybe even an advanced civilization? All right, let's dive into that first idea. Let's make the case for the Sage Wall being a man-made structure. What are the clues that point towards intelligent, ancient hands being at work here? Well, the people who believe this theory point to a few key things. First off, the wall's incredible straightness is really hard to just dismiss as an accident. Then you have the stones themselves. Many of them are these complex, polygonal shapes that seem to interlock with just startling precision. You can also see what look like deliberate courses, or rows of stones, laid one on top of the other. And then there are these mysterious little nubs or bumps on some of the blocks, a feature you see at other undisputed ancient sites. And maybe the most compelling clue, the entire wall seems to be perfectly aligned with the winter solstice. And then there's the sheer scale of it. The single biggest block in this wall is estimated to weigh a staggering 91 tons. Just think about that. Moving and placing a stone that heavy would be an immense engineering challenge even for us today, let alone for some supposed prehistoric culture.
And this is where it gets really wild. The style of the stonework, it isn't unique to Montana. It looks incredibly similar to ancient polygonal masonry you can find all over the world, from Sacsayhuaman in Peru to famous sites in Egypt and even Japan. It kind of suggests a possible connection, right? Maybe a shared building tradition across all these ancient cultures?
Okay, but hold on. Let's look at the other side of the coin. What if the Sage Wall isn't a ruin at all? What if it's just one of nature's most spectacular illusions? Because trust me, the geologists have a pretty compelling case of their own. The whole geological case really hinges on a process called orthogonal jointing. So think of it this way. When a huge mass of granite forms deep underground, it's under an insane amount of pressure. As that rock gets pushed up towards the surface over millions of years, that pressure is released and it causes the rock to crack in these remarkably straight lines, often at near perfect right angles. So how could that possibly create the Sage Wall? Well, imagine the process. First, magma cools way down deep in the earth. Then, as it's uplifted over eons, it cracks into those geometric, blocky patterns. Water seeps into those cracks, it freezes and expands, which pushes the gaps wider and wider, and finally, millions of years of wind and rain just wear away all the softer stuff around it, leaving the harder, more resistant, wall-like structure standing there.
And here's the crucial bit of context. While the Sage Wall is an absolutely spectacular example, geologists are quick to point out that it's not totally unique. Formations like this, these vertical granite walls and jointed rocks, all created by natural processes, they're found all throughout the Rockies, and even in places as far away as Siberia and New Zealand.
So, we've got two powerful competing theories. What can modern science tell us? Well, the Sage Mountain Center, which is where the wall is located, is right at the forefront of this investigation, using all sorts of technology to peel back the layers of this mystery. Now, you'd think science would give us a clear answer, right? Well, not exactly. In fact, the initial scientific data has only made things weirder. Ground-penetrating radar seems to show a flat base or some kind of foundation below the wall. Magnetic tests show an unusually high magnetic pole, so strong they've nicknamed the area the Drone Eater, and LiDAR imaging confirms the wall continues underground and even suggests there might have been a second parallel wall that collapsed. You know what's really cool, though? It's the approach the owners and researchers are taking. They are not trying to prove one theory over the other. They're totally committed to an open-minded investigation. They're pursuing both possibilities, and most importantly, they're sharing all of their data publicly for anyone in the world to analyze. So, after looking at all this evidence from both sides, the precise angles and global parallels versus the powerful, patient forces of geology, we're left right back where we started, with the ultimate question. When you look at the Sage Wall, what do you see? Is it just a stunning testament to the awesome creative power of nature, something so incredible it can mimic our own designs? Or is it a silent, stoic clue? A hint to a chapter of human history that we have completely forgotten? The wall isn't talking, and for now, the mystery endures.
All right, let's jump right in. We're heading high up into the Himalayas, to a place that was once called the Last Forbidden Kingdom. And there we're going to find one of the world's most incredible archaeological mysteries, the Sky Caves of Mustang. So take a look at this. This isn't natural. Nope. Carved into these massive cliff faces are something like 10,000 man-made caves. I mean, some of them are hundreds of feet up a sheer rock wall. It just immediately makes you wonder, right? Who in the world built these? How did they even get up there? And what have they been hiding for all these centuries?
Okay, so to really get a handle on these caves, you've got to understand the place itself. We're talking about Upper Mustang, which used to be its own kingdom, the Kingdom of Lo. And get this area was so remote, so cut off, that it was completely sealed from the outside world until 1992. 1992! That isolation basically turned it into a perfect time capsule, you know? It preserved a culture that's way more connected to ancient Tibet than modern Nepal.
And this just drives home the scale of what we're looking at. 10,000 caves. Just let that number sink in for a second. That's not just a few homes. That's like an entire civilization carved straight into a cliff face. And for the longest time, nobody knew for sure who built them, or how, or even why. It's basically a massive vertical ghost town.
But here's where it gets really fascinating. These caves, they're not just one thing. It's not like they were built for a single purpose and then abandoned. Nope. Archaeologists have figured out that their use actually changed, and changed dramatically, over 3 different eras. It's like a 3,000-year-old story of how a society survived and adapted, all told through these holes in the rock.
So it all breaks down like this. The whole story starts about 3,000 years ago. Back then, the caves were tombs, burial chambers. Fast forward to the 10th century and things got pretty turbulent. People actually moved into the caves to stay safe, turning these old tombs into their homes. Then, by the 1400s, life had settled down a bit. People moved back into the valleys, and the caves changed purpose again. They became these sacred spaces, monasteries, and meditation retreats for Buddhist monks. It's an incredible journey, right? From death to life, and finally, to a kind of spiritual enlightenment.
Now, for a long, long time, a lot of this was just, well, educated guesswork. But then, a totally chance discovery at a place called Samsung started to give us some real, solid answers. And of course, a whole lot of new questions. This one find, it was about to change everything we thought we knew.
And the breakthrough came from, well, from an earthquake. A chunk of the cliff face just collapsed, and it revealed something absolutely stunning. These weren't the caves people have been seeing. These were totally different. They were these complex, vertical shaft tombs, sealed up on purpose and completely hidden. I mean, if it weren't for that earthquake, explorers would have walked right past them, for centuries, never even knowing they existed.
So they get inside, and they find human remains that are super old. We're talking from the 3rd to the 8th centuries. This is way before Buddhism really took hold in the area. And on the bones, they find something really interesting. Distinct cut marks. This is the telltale sign of a defleshing ritual, probably an early version of what's called a sky burial, where the body is prepared and left for birds to return it to the natural world. And one tomb especially, Tomb 5, was a total game changer. It was clearly the burial of someone important, an elite, and the stuff they found inside, well, as this quote hints, it started to unravel the biggest mystery of them all. Was this Forbidden Kingdom really as isolated as everyone believed?
Inside this tomb, probably for some local leader, was just an incredible trove of artifacts. There was this beautiful painted wooden coffin, the skeletons of a man and a young child, sacrificed animals, really high-status stuff like copper pots and iron daggers. But amongst all that, there was another collection of items that really made the archaeologists stop and think.
Yeah, amidst all these amazing finds, it all came down to 3 specific types of items. These were the smoking gun, the proof that was about to completely rewrite the history books on Mustang and its place in the ancient world. So everything we thought we knew? Yeah, that was about to get flipped completely on its head. The assumption was always isolation, but the artifacts from this one single tomb painted a totally different picture. Mustang wasn't some remote, forgotten place at all. It was actually a bustling, super important crossroads, a hub on an ancient global superhighway.
And that's the key takeaway right here, this complete 180. What we thought was a remote, isolated kingdom turns out to be this majorly connected hub. This wasn't the end of the world, it was a critical link connecting the great empires of Asia. The science proved it.
And here's the proof, piece by incredible piece. First up, a death mask made of gold and silver. You just don't find these in Nepal, but it perfectly matches a burial tradition that stretches all the way west, through Tibet and into Kazakhstan. Okay, clue number 2. These amazing glass beads. They did a chemical analysis, basically an elemental fingerprint, and found they came from all over the place. We're talking Persia, modern-day Iran, Pakistan, some even came from South and Southeast Asia, probably traveling by sea before making the long trek into the mountains. And then, the final piece of the puzzle, the absolute clincher. A tiny little 5-centimeter scrap of Chinese silk. An unmistakable calling card of the legendary Silk Road.
And looking at a map, it all starts to make sense. See, the Kali Gandaki River Valley, which carves right through Mustang, is basically a natural highway through the Himalayas. It was the main artery connecting the salt trade from the Tibetan Plateau up north with all the grain and other goods from the Indian subcontinent to the south. That valley literally put Mustang on the map, making it a critical hub in this huge global exchange.
So, this incredible secret has been unlocked, and a piece of ancient history has been totally rewritten. But the story of the Sky Caves, it's not over. Not by a long shot. In fact, it's entering a new and really urgent chapter, because today, it's a race against time to save this fragile heritage before it's gone for good.
You see, all those thousands of unexplored caves and whatever priceless treasures are inside are facing 2 big threats. First, you've got looters, treasure hunters looking to make a profit. And second, you just have Mother Nature. The wind, the rain, The slow, steady erosion that's threatening to just crumble these sandstone cliffs and destroy everything.
So what's being done? Well, teams of archaeologists and conservation experts from all over the world are literally working against the clock. They're trying to document everything they can find and, this part is key, they're working with the local communities to help preserve their own history. The big goal is to create local museums so these artifacts can stay safe right there where they belong. It is a massive, massive effort to save this piece of our shared world heritage.
And that really brings us to the final, mind-blowing thought. Everything we just talked about, all of that came from one collapsed tomb. Meanwhile, there are still thousands and thousands of other caves, still sealed, still unexplored, just clinging to those cliffs. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other secrets, what other incredible stories are just waiting up there to be discovered?
All right, today we are diving into one of archaeology's most incredible puzzles, the stone giants of Bada Valley. Tucked away deep in the highlands of Indonesia, you've got hundreds of these silent stone figures just standing there, guarding a story that's been lost to time. Just look at this. I mean, for thousands of years, these silent giants have just been waiting. They're scattered all over this remote valley, their faces worn down by the elements, holding on to secrets we can only guess at. So the big questions are, right? Who on earth carved them? And maybe even more importantly, why? That's what we're going to try to figure out.
So let's start our investigation right where any explorer would, standing in front of these incredible sentinels, just completely baffled by the most basic questions. Who are they? And what is their story?
Okay, so where exactly are we? We're in a place called Central Sulawesi, in Indonesia. Specifically, a region known as the Lower Plateau. And it was way back in 1908 that a group of Dutch explorers first just stumbled upon these bizarre figures, bringing them to the world's attention. And since then, hundreds more have been found. The whole area is basically a giant open-air museum and a giant puzzle.
Now, when you look at these megaliths, you'll see they mostly come in two main types. First, you have the Arca. These are those stylized human-like statues, and some of them are huge. We're talking over 4.5 meters tall. Then you've got the Colombo, which are these massive cylindrical stone jars. So long before scientists showed up, you have to wonder, how did the local people explain them? Well, before any archaeologists got there with their fancy tools and dating techniques, the local people had their own answers, and they were powerful ones, weaving these stones right into the fabric of their culture through some incredible myths and legends. So let me introduce you to Palindo. This guy is probably the most famous of all the stone giants. His name actually means the entertainer. And the local story goes that he was once a court jester who stood up perfectly straight, but then these really fierce battles broke out between the local tribes, and the legend says the chaos and grief of it all literally knocked him crooked, and he's been tilted ever since. And Palindo's not the only one with a story. There's another one called Tutalako, who was supposedly a village guardian, but he got turned to stone because he stole rice. Another one, Takalia, was a criminal who was cursed to become a statue, and the deep cuts on him, those are said to be his old knife scars. And what about those giant jars, the kalamba? Well, some folks believed they were bathtubs for ancient royalty. You see, these stories weren't just stories. They gave the whole landscape meaning. They turned these silent rocks into moral lessons and guardians of the ancestors. Okay, so myths and legends are one thing. But what happens when we bring in the science? Let's switch gears and look at the hard scientific clues that are helping us piece together who these people really were. All right, first big question for the science team. Those giant stone jars, the Columba, what were they really for? Were they actually royal bathtubs? Maybe grain storage? What's the deal?
Well, after years of really careful digging, archaeologists found the answer. It turns out the Columba weren't for bathing or storing food at all. They were communal tombs. And what's really interesting is they even found smaller clay versions of these jars, and both types contain human bones. And here's the real smoking gun. Inside just one of these Columba jars, researchers found the remains of at least 10 adults and 1 child. That's what sealed it. These weren't for single burials. They were basically family tombs, used over and over again for generations. A huge part of the society's culture revolved around these burials. Okay, so knowing the jars were tombs was a huge step. But that just led to the next massive question. When did these people live? And let me tell you, dating these things has been incredibly tricky. The theories have been all over the map. Some said 5,000 years ago, others as recent as the 14th century. But The best, most solid piece of evidence we've got so far comes from some charcoal that was found buried right next to that Tadulako statue. And radiocarbon dating puts that specific site right around the 5th to 6th century AD. That plants it firmly in what's known as the early Metal Age.
Right, so that brings us to the next logical question. We're talking about a culture from about 1,500 years ago. How in the world did they manage to carve these enormous, incredibly hard stones? Well, if you go online, you'll find some pretty wild theories. Some people suggest they had some kind of lost ancient technology, maybe even a way to soften stone, turn it into a kind of plasma to mold it. It's a really cool idea for sure, but what does the actual rock science say?
The science actually gives us a much more down-to-earth answer through something called petrographic analysis, which is basically just studying the rock under a microscope. We know the megaliths are carved from a type of rock called quartz monzonite. And here's the key part. This stuff was available locally, right there in the valleys. They didn't have to haul it from hundreds of miles away. They just used the materials they had right at their feet.
But here's where it gets a little weird. Not a single tool has ever been found at any of these sites. Not one. Still, think about it. The time period is the early Metal Age, and the rock is super hard. So archaeologists are pretty confident the builders must have had metal tools. It's really the only way they could have sculpted these incredible monuments.
Okay, so we've got the what, we've got the where, and we have a pretty good idea of the when. So let's take all those clues and try to paint a picture, a portrait of the people who actually created all this.
So who were these people? Well, based on bones and DNA, we know they were part of the Southern Mongoloid group, which is connected to the huge family of Austronesian-speaking peoples that populated so much of Southeast Asia. And they weren't just wandering around. They lived in organized societies. They had separate areas for where they lived, where they performed rituals, and where they buried their dead. And man, were they skilled. They were masters of stone carving, obviously, but also of making pottery and even building stilt houses. And this might be the most mind-blowing connection of all. The DNA from the bones inside those burial jars, it shows a direct genetic link to people who are still living in Sulawesi today. The ancient builders aren't some mysterious lost civilization. Nope, they're the direct ancestors of modern tribes like the Kajang, the Mandar, and the Toraja. They never vanished, their descendants are still there. And we can see other little cultural fingerprints they left behind. Looking at their teeth tells us they had a really tough diet, because their teeth are incredibly strong. They also practiced something called pongar, which is a kind of ritual tooth filing. When they buried people, they included grave goods, like bowls and jugs, supplies for the afterlife. And their art is everywhere, on the statues, on the lids of the jars, with these repeating images of human faces, monkeys, and cool geometric patterns. So we've learned a ton, right? But this story is absolutely not over. It seems like for every single answer science gives us, a new, even deeper question pops up. And this is the biggest puzzle of all. Think about it. We have hundreds of these giant stone monuments that would have taken huge amounts of work and tons of people. But archaeologists have found no tools, no workshops, no ruins of the big villages that had to have been there to support a project like this. It's like the people, their houses, and all their stuff just poof, disappeared, leaving only these giant stones behind. So for now, the megaliths just stand there. They're silent witnesses in this incredible landscape. And even though we've studied it for over 100 years, it feels like it's barely given up any of its real secrets. They're a monument to a culture that we're only just starting to get to know. Which leaves us with one last, massive question. After all this time, after all the science, we know who their descendants are, but we still have no idea where the builders and their villages went. So you have to wonder, what other secrets are still waiting to be discovered, buried just beneath the surface in the land of 1,000 megaliths?